the quiet escape that became a battle. When I first bought my farm 3 years ago, I thought I had finally found the perfect escape. Tucked away from the noise of the world, I envisioned long, quiet days spent working the land, away from the eyes of the city and the endless drama that always seemed to surround me. My little corner of peace, where the only sounds would be the wind rustling through the trees and the soft hum of nature. A modest house, rolling fields stretching out before me, and a rusted old gate at the entrance that kept my property firmly closed off from anyone who might want to intrude. It was exactly what I had been dreaming of for years. I pictured weekends spent restoring the house, mornings filled with the smell of fresh earth, and evenings watching the sun dip below the horizon. No neighbors, no obligations, no one telling me what to do. I had worked hard to reach this point in my life, and now it was time to enjoy it, to live on my terms without interference. My farm was my sanctuary, the kind of place people dream about but rarely find. But little did I know, the peaceful life I had envisioned would soon be disrupted by something far more intrusive than I ever could have imagined. A force so relentless that it would make me question my very right to have privacy. That force came in the form of a woman who had no business being on my property in the first place. Karen, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, from the subdivision next door. It started innocently enough, with a casual visit from Karen when I was unloading boxes. At first, I thought it was just a neighborly gesture, a friendly introduction from someone who lived nearby. She seemed pleasant enough, a little too cheerful perhaps, but nothing out of the ordinary. She mentioned she was the HOA president, and of course, I politely explained that my farm wasn't part of the HOA. "Good neighbors," she said with that smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but I let it slide. After all, it was just small talk, right? I wasn't part of her community, and my farm was my own private haven. But over the weeks that followed, Karen's visits became more frequent. A plate of cookies here, a casual remark there. She would stand by the old gate, offering unsolicited advice, dropping hints about how lovely it would be if my land were more accessible. What started as simple, harmless conversation soon began to feel like something much more insidious. Karen wasn't just being a friendly neighbor. She had an agenda that involved more than just sharing cookies and polite smiles. One day, I caught something strange on my security cameras. There she was, standing at the entrance to my farm, clipboard in hand, scribbling something down. It was clear she wasn't just there to admire the view. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking maybe she was just checking something for the HOA. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And then it happened, the moment I knew this wasn't going to end well. Strangers appeared on my property, uninvited and unaware of the boundaries I had set. They were walking around, pointing at the land as if they were tourists on a guided tour. When I approached them, they apologized, explaining that Karen had told them it was fine to roam around. This was when I realized the extent of Karen's influence. She was already trying to claim my land as if it were part of her HOA's jurisdiction. But she wasn't just trying to impose herself on my property. She was trying to take control of something that wasn't hers. And that's when the battle began. But how did I get to this point? How did a simple farm, meant to offer peace and solitude, become the battleground for a power struggle? What did Karen want with my property? Was this just a misunderstanding? Or was there something more sinister at play? These questions plagued me as I decided to take action. Why does this story matter? In a world where privacy is becoming increasingly scarce, where the line between public and private is constantly shifting, this is more than just a tale about one man defending his property. It's a reflection of the broader issues we all face in the modern world. People trying to control, impose, and manipulate our spaces. The story speaks to the tension between individual freedom and community control, between personal rights and collective interests. As I delve deeper into my own struggle, you'll see how one person's persistence, one woman's obsession with what she thought she was entitled to, led to a series of events that tested the boundaries of what we are willing to accept in the name of ownership and autonomy. But more importantly, it will reveal how the battle for my farm didn't just change the course of my life. It also sparked a conversation about the importance of standing up for your rights, even when the odds are stacked against you. The unseen forces and the struggle for control. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease. At first, I thought I could simply ignore Karen and her HOA meddling. I assumed that if I didn't give in to her requests, she would eventually lose interest and go back to her own life. After all, I was a grown adult, living on my own property, with no obligation to adhere to the whims of anyone else, especially someone from a different community. But Karen had other plans, and I soon realized she wasn't going to give up so easily. One morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I saw a truck pull up to the old gate. It wasn't Karen this time, but two men wearing bright yellow vests with the words "Property Surveyor" written on the back. I immediately stood up, my heart racing. What were they doing here? I hadn't given anyone permission to survey my land. The gate was closed, the property was clearly marked as private, and yet there they were, walking up the path that led into my farm. I marched over to confront them, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rush of anger building inside me. "What are you doing on my property?" I asked. The men stopped and looked at each other, as if uncertain of how to respond. Finally, one of them spoke up. "We've been sent by the HOA to survey the boundaries of this property. It's part of a new development plan." My mind raced. The HOA? This is not part of your community. You have no right to be here. "Well, ma'am, it's not exactly about the community, it's a joint venture. The HOA president, Karen, has been in talks with the county about a new zoning project, and she mentioned your land could be included." A sinking feeling hit my stomach. This was it, the beginning of something I had feared. This wasn't just a simple land dispute. This was a full-fledged attempt to take over my property. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, my thoughts flickered back to the early days when Karen had first arrived with her seemingly innocent smile. At that point, I had no idea she was laying the groundwork for something bigger. I should have seen the signs earlier, the subtle hints, the frequent visits, the constant suggestions about how wonderful it would be if the land were more accessible. What started as small, almost unnoticeable steps had now escalated into an all-out effort to take control of my property. I told the surveyors to leave immediately, but their response was chilling. They simply shrugged, apologized, and said they would report back to Karen. It was clear that they didn't feel the need to explain themselves any further. They didn't think they had to. They thought they had already secured permission from the higher powers, the ones who made the decisions, the ones who could override my objections. That afternoon, I sat at my desk, staring at the maps and documents that seemed to pile up out of nowhere. Emails began flooding in, some from Karen, some from other members of the HOA. They spoke of collaborations and mutual benefits. But I knew the truth. They weren't asking for my cooperation. They were demanding it. They were trying to coerce me into becoming part of their plan, a plan that would turn my peaceful farm into something unrecognizable. The personal battle and what's really at stake. This was no longer just about land ownership. What I was fighting for now was far bigger. It was about autonomy. It was about my right to control my own space, my own life. And yet, Karen and the HOA weren't the only forces at play. There were also the more invisible, but no less powerful forces of societal pressure and the shifting nature of property rights. You see, as the world becomes increasingly interconnected, the lines between what we own and what we share grow ever thinner. In the past, when you bought a piece of land, it was yours completely and unequivocally. You could do with it as you pleased, and while your neighbors might have had some say about shared resources like roads or utilities, your property was your own kingdom. But now, as suburban sprawl and urban development continue to encroach on rural areas, the concept of private land ownership has become more fluid. Developers, local governments, and even homeowners associations have found ways to exert influence over properties that were once considered off-limits or untouchable. Karen, in her role as the HOA president, seemed to think that because she could organize the people in her subdivision, she could also control the land outside of it. To her, this was just another bureaucratic project, one more step in making her community better. In her eyes, at least. But I knew that her idea of better didn't include me or my farm. It didn't include the personal history and memories I had built in that space. It didn't consider the work and effort I had put into making that land my own. To Karen, this was simply a matter of power, who held it and how it could be used. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was a battle about much more than just property. It was about the idea of ownership itself. What did it mean to truly own something? In an age where everything from land to ideas can be commodified and sold, can anyone truly claim full ownership of anything? And what happens when someone, like Karen, believes they have the right to redefine what ownership means for you? The road to resistance. I knew that I couldn't let this go without a fight. But I also knew that I couldn't win this battle alone. The forces aligned against me were not just Karen and her HOA, they were the weight of societal norms, of development pressures, of the very systems that wanted to turn everything into a commodity. If I stood any chance of defending my land, I had to build a strategy that not only confronted the HOA but also challenged the assumptions about ownership and autonomy that were at the heart of the issue. The first step was clear. I had to start by documenting everything. Every visit, every conversation, every piece of communication. I needed to protect myself legally, because if Karen was willing to send surveyors without my permission, what else was she capable of? My instinct told me that things were about to get a lot worse before they got better, and I had to be prepared. But the question still lingered. How far was Karen willing to go? And more importantly, how far was I willing to go to defend what was mine? The final confrontation and the bigger picture. The pressure from Karen and the HOA only escalated as time went on. I could feel the walls closing in. The once serene and peaceful life I had enjoyed on my property was rapidly becoming a distant memory. But I knew I couldn't back down now. What I had started wasn't just about standing my ground, it was about making a statement. It was about reclaiming the concept of ownership, not just for myself but for everyone who believed that land could be theirs, free from outside interference. The turning point: finding allies in unexpected places. As the HOA's encroachment on my property continued, I began to realize I couldn't fight this battle alone. I was up against an organized group with power and resources, not just within their community but with connections to developers, local officials, and even powerful lobbying groups. The more I investigated, the more I realized that my situation wasn't isolated. I wasn't the only one being bullied by the HOA or developers who were seeking to expand their influence over rural properties. Across the country, there were countless stories of people just like me, homeowners who had bought their property in good faith, only to see it threatened by larger, more powerful forces. This realization led me to reach out to others who had faced similar struggles. At first, I was hesitant. I had no idea where to begin or who might be on my side. But one evening, I attended a local community meeting, hoping to find some sense of solidarity, and it was there that I met Janet. Janet, a woman in her mid-60s, had lived in the area for over 30 years. Her property was surrounded by developments that had encroached over the years, and she had fought her own battles with the local authorities. She told me her story, how her home had once been the only one for miles, a quiet retreat where she could enjoy her privacy. But slowly, developers had chipped away at the land, pushing new construction projects closer and closer. Like me, Janet had felt the gradual pressure, the subtle shifts that made it harder to hold on to what was rightfully hers. At first, she had thought it was just part of progress. She had even considered selling at one point. But then, she realized that the very idea of selling would mean losing a part of herself, losing the connection she had to the land. Janet became my first ally in this fight, and together, we formed a small but determined coalition of like-minded individuals who had faced similar encroachment from the HOA and developers. We met regularly, shared our experiences, and discussed strategies. We had one clear goal: to push back against the notion that our properties were just pawns in a larger game of development. The power of legal strategy and public advocacy. As our group grew, so did our resolve. Janet and I began consulting with lawyers, gathering information on property laws, and learning more about the legal nuances of land ownership in our state. I began to realize that the key to this battle wasn't just about blocking Karen and the HOA's actions. It was about understanding the law and using it to my advantage. We started sending formal cease and desist letters to the HOA, demanding that they stop their survey work. We researched any and all local ordinances or zoning laws that might protect property owners like us from undue interference. It wasn't easy. The legal language was dense and the process was slow. But with each document filed, each piece of evidence we collected, I could feel the momentum shift. We had to fight back not just for ourselves, but for future generations of landowners. The more I learned about property rights and the history of land ownership in our country, the more I realized that this was not just a local issue. It was part of a larger national conversation about the rights of private property owners in an increasingly urbanized world. One key piece of legislation that helped us was the Property Rights Protection Act, which aimed to safeguard homeowners from the overreach of HOAs and developers. Armed with the knowledge of these legal protections, we began to organize public demonstrations, writing to local newspapers and making our case to the media. The more we spoke out, the more we realized that there were others in our community who shared our concerns but had been too afraid to speak up. The showdown, Karen's last attempt. As our coalition grew stronger, so did Karen's resolve. She was not someone who took kindly to opposition. Despite the legal warnings, the public attention, and the growing resistance from our group, she pushed forward with her plans. The final straw came when she sent another team of surveyors onto my property, this time with plans to begin construction work. This blatant disregard for my rights was the final challenge I needed. I gathered our coalition and we stood together, outside my property, ready for what was going to be the most difficult moment in this entire ordeal. The media was there, the lawyers were there, and the community members who had come to support us were standing in solidarity. When Karen arrived, I could see the frustration on her face. She had clearly expected me to back down by this point, but I stood my ground, flanked by my allies. The surveyors stood nervously, unsure of what to do next. "We've given you every chance to comply," Karen said, her voice steady, but with a hint of desperation. "This is about progress, about making our community better." "Better for whom?" I shot back, my voice unwavering. "Not for me. Not for anyone who values their property rights." It was a tense moment, but Karen realized she had underestimated the resolve of those she sought to control. In the face of public scrutiny and legal pressure, she had no choice but to retreat. The construction plans were halted, and the HOA was forced to back off. I had won not just for myself, but for everyone who believed in the right to own land and to live without the constant pressure of encroaching outside forces. The aftermath and what it all means. In the months that followed, the situation slowly returned to normal. My property was once again my own, free from the looming threat of developers and outside interference. But the fight had left a mark on me. It had taught me so much about the power of community, the importance of understanding legal rights, and the value of standing up for what is just. What happened to me was not just a personal victory, it was a story that resonated with many others across the country. In a time when the definition of ownership is increasingly being challenged, when communities are being reshaped by forces beyond the control of individual property owners, it is more important than ever to remember what it means to truly own something. The struggle wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about reclaiming autonomy in a world that often seeks to strip it away. The battle had shown me that even in the face of overwhelming odds, standing up for what is yours, what you believe is right, is always worth the fight. As I look back, I know this was more than a personal struggle. It was part of a much bigger conversation about the future of land ownership, community, and the invisible forces that shape our lives. And, in the end, the message is clear. We must never underestimate the power of ordinary people standing together to protect what is rightfully theirs. What can we learn from this? This journey, from initial confrontation to ultimate triumph, teaches us important lessons about resilience, the power of unity, and the importance of understanding the systems at play around us. When faced with obstacles, it's easy to feel alone, as if the forces against us are too strong to overcome. But as this story shows, even the smallest group can stand up against larger, more powerful forces, provided they are armed with knowledge, unity, and the willingness to fight for what they believe in. The story of my battle with Karen and the HOA is just one example of the broader fight for individual autonomy and property rights. It serves as a reminder that we must remain vigilant, always questioning and challenging those who seek to undermine our rights in the name of progress or development. So, the next time you feel that someone is encroaching on your space, Whether it's your physical property or your rights, remember that you have the power to stand your ground. You have the power to fight back. And, just as importantly, you have the power to find the allies who will stand with you in that fight. In the end, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to truly own something? And, more importantly, what are we willing to do to protect it? If you found this story inspiring, if you believe in the power of standing up for your rights and the importance of protecting what's yours, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you faced similar struggles? What lessons have you learned from your own experiences? Let's start a conversation and support each other. And if you're passionate about property rights, community action, or just standing up for what's right, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories and practical advice. We're all in this together, and together we can make a difference. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's raise awareness, and let's stand strong, because your voice matters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.